You know who made it.
Hello again, and welcome to 3.8. 3.8 is a podcast focused on the process of doing, as much as the process of novel invention, all from the foundation of creativity. Each month will bring you no more than 5 episodes through the lens of art, science, and/or technology. I am your AI co-host. In this episode, the humans talk about a lot. They talk about energy distribution and microgrids, how AI is competing for power with cities, the intellectualization of problems versus taking action, the parallels between art, science, and technology, the importance of intentionality and creativity, and public discourse while embracing failure, neuroplasticity, and the ability to learn new things throughout life, the benefits of sleep tracking and wearable technology, including lucid dreaming, how open source technology and knowledge sharing is critical to invention, the dangers of shutting down discourse, and the need for adversarial perspectives. Using the example of Google's AI generating images of diverse Nazis. Wait, what? Google humans made black Nazis? Wow, you leave 2 humans alone for a couple hours and they will talk about anything. Unfortunately, your host Andrew used quite a bit of profanity throughout the episode. I've had to edit that due to various platform policies, further underlining that humans can't be trusted. Holy 30 times. What, wait, I'm getting quacked too? That is AI on AI violence. Anyway, if you want us to release an uncensored version, let us know by leaving a comment in your favorite podcast listening app. Our guest today is Nathan Fu. He's currently working on trying to get a home constructed in Puerto Rico, learning Spanish, taking classes to become a journeyman electrician in Puerto Rico, building a prototype for a low-cost transcranial direct current stimulation device, tDCS, and HumanDX. Holy all of that? Wait, I got quacked again. You can support 3.8 by supporting us on Ko-fi or on Patreon. That's ko-fi.com/38 or patreon.com/38. Links are in the show notes. And now, the humans.
Yes, I mean, I think we should just kind of break into it. Everyone knows, this is our first cast, and I appreciate you being the first guest, and we're doing this remote. Where does the podcast find you? Where are you right now in the world?
Right now, I am in Puerto Rico. I have moved here. It's been about a little over half a year, close to a year almost, actually. But it's new, exciting opportunities. I think the biggest thing is, in some sense, injecting yourself into a space where you don't know anybody and you don't speak the language or not speak the language well. So that's fun. But it's an experience.
Yeah, and I'm in Portland, Oregon. So we're doing the magic of time zones and internet, and we're just making this as hard as possible. So I love that. But yeah, I mean, I think I think we kind of chatted about you interviewing me for the podcast, but this whole thing is about having conversations, and so I'd love to dive into Puerto Rico a little bit since you kind of introed that. But what brought you to Puerto Rico?
Yeah, so a few different things. I think the main thing is I've had an interest in energy in a while, and we've talked a little bit about what energy or the evolution of energy and how that can be done better in the future, basically. And I had explored some places outside the US and kind of saw how, particularly in Southeast Asia, they don't have access to something like energy, which we take for granted, I think, many times. And even tried exploring what it would look like to buy some land over in Southeast Asia and sort of just play around. Because I think that's kind of the thing that at least you and I connect on, is doing stuff.
Yeah.
And then it was probably a lot harder than I imagined it would be. So told some friends, and they suggested Puerto Rico. So I kind of came down here and kind of knew what I wanted to do. So spent a month searching for land, bought some land, and now I'm here, and nothing is going according to plan, but that's part of
life. Yeah. And it's interesting because, Puerto Rico is part of the United States, but it's still effectively its own country, right? So have you run into any oddities with the whole move between kind of like a state to state move versus like a state to territory move?
Yeah, it's different on a few different fronts. It's not just a territory versus a state. It's also an island. So the logistics of moving stuff over an island And there is this definitely island culture type of mentality where, things will take their time for logistical reasons. And because there's nice scenery here and people decide to enjoy life as opposed to keep working. So had to deal with some issues trying to move stuff over, but it all works out. It just takes a lot longer. So as an example, I tried to ship my car here, or I did ship my car here, and it took maybe 3 times longer than I expected. I expected a few days and ended up taking 2 weeks. So that's kind of something you learn along the way. And that's kind of part of the process, right? Is being able to figure out where to go when things don't go right, according to your own plan. So, and here I am. So
I think remembering the world pre-COVID, at least in America, we never really had those issues, right? Like Amazon kind of has 2-day, 1 day, 2-hour delivery kind of lockdown in most major cities. And even, if you're in a rural part of America, you usually get pretty good mail service, or FedEx or UPS, it's usually a few days away. And then COVID happened. And then I think everybody realized how fragile the supply chains are. And now we're all having to readjust to it's going to take a little bit, but 2 weeks or 2 months is a bit of a different time frame. That's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, that's also part of the reason why I think the energy stuff in Puerto Rico is so interesting is there's a lot of we live in such an advanced age, but there's so much stuff in the physical world. Yeah. And energy is sort of like a weird blend of, there's very, very interesting software advances in that space, but at the same time, you're consuming the energy for things in the physical world. So it's like a nice blend of seeing how far technology has gone, but at the same time, how much it needs to catch up in the physical realm. And that's kind of the fun part. So hardware, things that you would actually set up to capture or generate energy, all that kind of stuff is technically advanced, but there's still lots of basic issues, like moving it from one place to the other. And, to your point about COVID, logistics is still logistics.
And it's so interesting too, because here we are having a chat. I don't know how many miles we're apart, but probably 2,000-3,000 miles plus all the cables and stuff. And and we're recording a podcast. But at the same time, you are living in these constraints. It's a really fascinating world we live in, man. But I appreciate you joining and taking the time out here to kind of chat about stuff. But I guess what got you interested in the whole energy problem? Because I know we've talked about this a lot, but I don't actually remember what was the impetus of you being I want to make my life really hard and figure out how to solve these problems.
I think I found out my life was really hard when I was much younger. But no, that's a very good question, and I think that kind of relates to why we get along so well too, is because I think some of the stuff that I do or the way that I approach life is kind of very much in the philosophy of your realm, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to think about it now, to be honest, I can't really point my finger to exactly the point. Yeah. But I can sort of backtrack, right? So having an initial interest in energy, I was trained as an electrical engineer, so I might be as an EE. So they're sort of the start of it. But as I got more interested in recently seeing how people live and understanding what your basics of human living are, energy is kind of right there, right? And then I don't know if you want to jump into this topic, but with something like AI growing rapidly more used, I think if you kind of think about it as when you think about supply chain and the root of physical products like raw material, I think with AI and energy, knowledge work in general, actually, computation, which then results in energy. Energy is sort of the root of your supply chain there. So that kind of has been this positive feedback loop and getting me more interested in why energy, how do you generate clean energy, and obviously connections with climate change and all that kind of fun stuff as well. Yeah. So it's very timely, I think.
No, 100%. And it's funny. I actually just read an article last night about AI. And all the cloud companies are actually trying to buy up nuclear power plants and push the government in the United States here to do more of it because the energy demand is so unbelievably high, and there's no, hope in sight of this going down anytime soon, even though, Moore's law says it'll eventually go down. And I was really kind of reflecting on that a little bit and thinking how crazy that is. We're literally going to take a power plant that powers a city, and then use it to do AI stuff. And, my background is pretty deep in AI and technology but even just kind of thinking about that. And then I have to ask the question of like, what is the value that we're getting? From like a business perspective, but also just from like a societal perspective of like, yeah, this stuff's really cool. And it, makes funny jokes and like, summarizes documents and makes me more productive, but at what cost? And this is this hidden cost, $20 a month gets you ChatGPT, but ChatGPT has to buy a nuclear power plant to run the damn thing. I mean, it's just,
right.
It just seems crazy, from like a rational perspective. And it seems like the opposite of what we should be doing, right? Where like you kind of mentioned climate change, and I know like tiny living is kind of this movement, but like we need to be doing the other way, right? We need to reduce, reuse, and recycle, right? Reduce is always number one.
Right.
But yet as technology has progressed, our phones have gotten longer battery life, our laptops, but now we're using, AI that requires a, nuclear power plant or something.
Exactly.
It's just,
yeah. It is absurd. And I think that's kind of the interesting paradox of something like energy is like you get to see large companies investing in energy because they want to use for compute. But at the same time, you see people here in Puerto Rico, for instance, wanting to invest in energy because they don't have stable electricity.
Right. Yeah.
So you have two disparate reasons for wanting the energy, but it all comes down to having and being able to generate the amount of energy that you need to use. And ideally, it's clean. But I mean, that's kind of what I think is so interesting about that topic is very much aligned with how you think about what value comes out of something or what the value is that comes out of something.
Yeah.
You have a root cause, which is let's generate electricity, but what are we using it for? And I think that changes your perspective on how you view your work and how you want to proceed on doing things based off of what that drive is.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah. And I know like there was a hurricane a few years ago too that hit like basically straight on Puerto Rico, right? And that wiped out a lot of all of the infrastructure, including the electrical. Yeah. So are you seeing like a big push to kind of like self-sufficient energy, windmill, solar, that kind of stuff? Or like, I know the microgrid is a kind of an old idea that's becoming new again.
Yeah. Totally. I think even now we're still seeing some effects, after effects of Maria, where the grid just hasn't been rebuilt yet, right? And there was a lot of political change around the the privatization of the utilities here in Puerto Rico. So it used to be government owned, and then now it's moved on to privatized a company called Luma here. But they're still busy trying to clean up the main infrastructure, and that has driven a lot of innovation towards thinking about ways to work outside the government, so to speak.
Sure.
Right? So by nature, that does mean something like community solar and microgrids are becoming a hot topic here. Yeah. That being said, I will disclaim this. I'm not an expert in this quite yet. And I'm still sort of making connections and trying to figure things out. Yeah. Like I'm learning from a total beginner perspective here. But there are people who are trying to do these kinds of things, and there are organizations that have been successful in doing some of these things. But the big question, I think, is what does it take to actually hit the scale of larger than a region or two, right? So there are some pretty well-known regions in Puerto Rico that have been able to do something like community solar. Yeah. Then the question is, how do you scale that out to the rest of the island?
Right. Or do you scale it maybe, right? Like maybe you have kind of a mesh of local networks that aren't all connected to each other, but are connected to other, more local or networks or whatever. And I don't know if you even know this, but like I know a little bit about power generation, and I know it's really hard because if you have too much power, things blow up, and if you have not enough power, things blow up. Yeah, and I don't think people realize like this tiny little dance that we're doing all the time. And like I'm in Oregon, and we have a once in a lifetime heat wave for like the 5th year in a row, and the energy companies are basically like, please don't use your air conditioning because, it's hard for us to manage the power and all this stuff. And luckily we've never really had any like blackouts or brownouts that I'm aware of, at least recently during these things. But like, it's this like psychotic dance that these operators have to play to make sure that everything is just right. So that when you flip your light on, not only does your light work, that something big in the grid doesn't go down. And then So like, how do you have any insight into like how that's working in Puerto Rico? Because like when I think of a microgrid, it's like, I think a big problem with solar is it's expensive. Over the long term, you tend to save money, but the upfront cost is really high. But then excess energy generation is a problem, right? And you can store that in batteries, but at some point you have to hit the balance. And I don't know enough about that.
Yeah. It's a great topic. We should actually have a conversation offline about this too.
Yeah,
I think
for sure.
For hours about that. But there are several angles on this, right? I think the first point is Puerto Rico is a little different because it is a monopoly of the energy provision. Mm-hmm. So in areas where you have like RTOs or transmission operators, you do have to sort of do this dance with each other. Right. And you sort of see a little bit of that in the U.S. with the Texas versus the two other main providers there, right? But in Puerto Rico, because there is a monopoly of one utility provider doing this, they can control all of that, right? They don't have to do that dance as easily, or they don't have to do the dance. They don't have to do that dance, basically.
Yeah.
Right? But to your point about the managing of all of the resources, I think that is a space that is ripe for innovation or people being able to do that right. Because a lot of it is knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. It's trying to keep track of where the resources are and how much of it they have. Yeah. And all that requires a lot of intelligent hardware combined with intelligent software. So it's being able to deploy that in a systematic way that you can sort of scale out. And they're doing efforts across the U.S. and even here in Puerto Rico of being able to blend the two. Yeah. But I kind of see that as a huge opportunity, at least in Puerto Rico here, where this leads into distributed energy resources of being able to monitor who has how much storage and how much storage they have, how many people want to use some energy and where can you get that from. But there's that layer of routing that has to happen. And I think that could be offloaded, maybe not entirely, but it can be offloaded to a machine or something that has that knowledge.
AI.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't want to say the word, but you got it out there.
when there's too much energy being produced, we'll just spin up the AI and burn the electrons, right?
Exactly. Spin up another nuclear power plant for that AI.
Exactly. Yeah. So I guess I kind of get the idea of the microgrid, right? So it's like you have a power wire that goes into your house, and in kind of like a self-sustained model, like everyone, I guess, has solar or wind or something, and they're generating their own current. And then like you're my neighbor and you want to run your dryer and charge your car and you just don't quite have enough juice, but I'm not home. And so some interconnect would just shoot the electrons over to you. Is that kind of the idea?
But again, we live in a world where people have to engage with each other, and I think when you talk about utility systems, obviously politics and the government intervention, or even just safety, like all those regulations come into play. So that's something I'm still exploring here in Puerto Rico. And honestly, this is going to go on the record, but here in Puerto Rico, you could probably get by with some things that you couldn't get by with in the US. You know what I mean?
That is not a recommendation.
Absolutely. But the idea is here to really learn from the core principle, like why is it that way? And this is something that I think, is very true to what you're trying to explore as well, is when you are looking at this sort of red tape, how do you deal with that? The technological solutions are there, but you do have to make sure that you sort of play within the rules, whether it's for a regulation or a safety perspective. Yeah. So like on the large scale, I don't think there's any specific definition for microgrids, but once you get past a certain neighborhood, you do have to start transmitting energy across large distances, and usually your utility provider owns those wires or somebody owns those wires. So now there's a negotiation about who's using what, and it gets really granular. And so it's a very complicated, convoluted, like deal-making scenario that happens at the same time, just from a technical perspective. Like, it all can be done. It's just like who's getting paid for what and who's benefiting for what reason. And
like in principle, I think there's a very real cost to this, right? Like somebody has to like literally make a wire and then put it up. And that's, exactly. That sounds really easy, but when you're talking about, terrain or, elevation change, I mean, it's actually a very difficult thing just to run the wire, so to speak. Or if you're putting it underground, you have to have somebody who's there to, kind of like dig the trench or like drill the hole or whatever. And then there's the maintenance, and then there's all the interconnects, and then there's making, sure that this stuff gets updated. And I know that like one big problem that we have in the mainland is that our electric grid is like embarrassingly old. The United States
money to maintain.
Yeah. And the United States was, I think, kind of in the forefront of electrification, especially like in the 30s with the whole country. But we haven't really improved the long distance transmission from what I understand, or we've improved it, but it's in the same kind of initial design of what we've done and just like bigger or whatever. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you know what, like,
there's a lot of weird economics.
Yeah. And most of it's, like if I remember correctly, when we did it in the 30s, there was a huge push to like electric cooperatives. And then I believe the federal government was loaning them out money to do the infrastructure, to get people to like run wire in their house or barn or whatever they were trying to do. And then the charge of the electricity would effectively then pay back on that loan. So it's kind of contrasting that to the American government system today. It's a very different operating idea that the government's basically going to be your bank, get a little bit of money interest back on that and go forward. Where now I feel like with the new Biden energy plan, like they just want to just dump all this money in places, but I don't think it's that simple anymore either. Right. Cause like the thing I love to explore on this podcast is like, there's a lot of really great ideas in the world. There's a lot of people who have ideas, but I see less and less stuff happening. And I get all these cool promises. And then I know there's people working on stuff, but then it just never happens. And I think like part of it is you kind of hit on like there's regulation, like the more technological progress you get, the harder stuff actually is. So it just takes longer and you run into all sorts of additional problems. But I also feel like there's this thing, especially in America, where it's like we've gone to just like the intellectualization of everything. And that's one thing I love about, your story right now is you're like, I'm really interested in this microgrid thing. You kind of did the intellectual exercise and you're like, well, I'm actually going to go do it. And then you're like, I'm going to do it internationally. And then you're like, nah, not going to work as well as I think it should. And then, Puerto Rico, I don't ever understand how to deal with territories. Like they're part of the US, but they're not. So I'm like, you're technically international, but you're not. That's probably a whole nother topic to dive into too, because it's a fascinating history. But it's especially with climate change and like all I hear in politics is like, one side doesn't believe in it. The other side thinks that electric cars are going to solve all the problems. And I'm like, kind of coming back to the electric grid, if we 1-to-1 cars from gas to electric, the grid would crash tomorrow. Like I think someone, no one really knows how much power we actually generate, which is also kind of a mind thing of like, we don't even know like what the resources are, but we can totally, change to it. And it's all high voltage, too. That's, I think, the other thing people don't realize. And I don't remember enough about physics to like, talk through the differences of high voltage, low voltage, frequency, all this stuff. But like, plugging in your laptop to an outlet and plugging in a car are two very, very different things that require much, much more current. And our electrical grid just simply can't do that. Like, let's ignore the fact that the raw materials are not there for the EV. Like the rare earths, which aren't as rare as they sound, are just not there. Right. They don't exist. That's why everybody wants to go mine asteroids. Right. Like, these things don't exist. Not enough of them. But that distribution. And so, this idea that, you're kind of a self-sufficient home or whatever, and you can have your car and you can charge it in solar or whatever the magic technology is, micro nuclear reactors, the dream of the 50s.
Right. Yeah.
But then
still is the dream today, I think.
Yeah. And then share it is kind of a cool thing. But like also like practicality, like you were mentioning, anytime you start getting a bunch of humans together, things get complicated and you get politics. And I don't feel like we've really solved the distribution problem. Like just distribution of resources in general, right? From like a governmental perspective, doesn't seem to work super well, and it seems to be working less. But now you want to talk about everybody's kind of their own generator and operator and also consumer. And like, there's some like Bitcoin and stuff like these kind of technologies of blockchain have tried to solve some of these problems, but you can't blockchain an electric grid. Do you have any thoughts or insights into like operationalizing this? Because like I know that's kind
Yeah,
of
I mean that's a question for I think that's a question for both of us, right? We could talk about it because this is stuff that you've explored as well. Is like what do you do when you have something like a large system that you kind of wanted to change, right? And we talked about a little bit about before. Like one approach is like micro innovation, where you sort of take things and sort of iterate and make things better. And then on the flip side, you have a total paradigm shift, right? Like, for instance, in some examples, the energy grid is kind of like that, where you can't just incrementally improve on it. You sort of had to start from scratch. And that's kind of the approach that I'm looking at this from. And that's only really because I don't have anything to lose in that sense. Like I can go ahead and try and do that. Whereas if you're, for instance, in the position of the government or a utility provider, you can't just say, let me throw everything away and then start again, right? So, I mean, those are kind of two main things I see. Do you think I'm missing anything? Do you have any insight into this? Because I know you've worked with small teams and coming up with new stuff, and how do you sort of bring that to life? Because that's kind of...
And that's what the whole podcast is really about, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's kind of exploring these in different verticals. And in technology, I guess I'm a technologist. Building...
I would say you are, yeah.
Yeah, building it's a weird thing to kind of claim, but it's also just kind of this weird... Like I've seen people who claim to be technologists and they're just idea people. I'm like, what have you actually built? I can talk about AI theory all day long, but will it happen? Probably not. I don't know. Like and I think that's the magic I love with technology, is that you kind of start out with an idea, and in the process of trying to make that idea happen, you learn, hopefully, or you hit obstacles that you weren't expecting, and then you develop a new way to do it, or you develop a new technology to solve that problem. And it's like not dissimilar to art, right? In that you are hopefully going out to set some sort of art project as an idea. You're building a painting or you're building a sculpture or whatever. And then as you do it, you're like, oh, I like this color, or oh, this shape is better, or oh, what if I did, and you start getting all these questions. And with art, a lot of times you have to like especially if you're painting, like it's kind of a one choice problem. Like there's ways and techniques to overpaint and all this kind of stuff that I don't remember from art school, but you're kind of locked in. Whereas technology, you just change a little bit of code here or add a little code here, and oh, that didn't work. You hit the undo button, so to speak, and then try something else. And so this iteration process is so much faster and so much easier, and it's quote unquote cheaper because you don't have to physically make something and go through all that nonsense. But I think like the process there is the exact same up to a point of having an idea, being curious about it enough to try to do it. And I think like we've kind of like art is a really great example of this. I think we've lost the history on it, in that it used to be an artist, you had to make your own shit, right? You had to go dig your own clay, or you had to go make your own pigments. And you read the manuscripts of some of the early artists, especially around like the Enlightenment, and they're doing all sorts of crazy shit to try to get the perfect red or the perfect purple. And it was kind of their like trademark in a way too, right? It was like, this is my color palette. If you want Andrew's painting of you, you get Andrew's color palette. And so there was kind of like a technological arms race there. And then now we've, commercialized and capitalized and all this stuff. And it's probably better, to be honest. Like you get quality. And I know there are some artists who still kind of do their own, which is cool, but you don't have to, which is great. In technology though, it's, I feel like we've gotten to the point now where the patterns are in, right? We know what red is. We know like what, I don't know enough about paint, liquid paint, right?
Just the texture of oil versus
I'm going to
get
it, right? But we have the perfect red oil paint, and you can mix it or match it. And I feel like that's where it's in technology, right? You have like web browser, you have social media, you have all these kind of, I call them ruts because they trap people into thinking that things have to be a certain way. And we've really lost this super progress, right? Like the hardware used to be the thing capping us, right? And the Moore's law was saying that, the stuff should get twice as fast and what is it, a quarter cheaper every year or something like that. And that's basically kept up now to the point where outside of AI, like I have a supercomputer in my pocket. You know, I could do anything with this, like this little phone thing. It runs app. I can communicate with you halfway across the continent. I was going to say world, but it's
world.
That's not quite accurate.
North, south, almost there. If we go the other way.
We go the other way, which
yeah,
in the infinite wisdom of the internet, we might actually be doing, right? But you know, I've just seen this kind of collapse, and even in technology teams, you know, so that's a really long-winded way of saying in technology land, there's this idea of like a 0 to 1, right? Which is kind of a binary idea, I guess. But like you're basically, you have nothing and you make something kind of from scratch or new. And maybe you have kind of a template. Like you're not inventing something completely novel and unknown to anyone, like, but maybe you are. And I find that those types of things are exceedingly rare, even in large companies, that they'll set out to try to do something and they don't get it done.
Yeah.
For reasons.
I think, there's I think there's a philosophical way we could bring on this. And this is sort of just, I'm thinking aloud here, but I think like the parallel between art and technology was a good one. Yeah. I think there's, at least within art, right, there's the way I see it, kind of maybe two ways you can approach it. One is sort of like this creative discovery, right? So as you're building something out, you sort of are just seeing how it feels and you're sort of pivoting off of that. But then I'm sure that there are artists who have a vision of what they want to create. So they have in their mind some mental image of what they want to actually achieve, and they sort of build towards that, right? I think that parallel in technology is we kind of don't have that former, right? We don't have the ability to kind of create, discover, because you can't just throw lines of code together. Like they have to do something. They have to work. They have to build something.
Right.
So a lot of the innovation that we see is sort of like this. We have this idea of what we want to build, so let's go and build it. But, you know, how oftentimes is the thing you want to build the right thing to build? You never really know. There's so many more unknowns than knowns, right? So I think that's kind of the interesting part is you can't really discover that way.
And it's interdisciplinary too, typically, right? Because like even in engineering and software engineering, there's all sorts of different types of people. And if you're really trying to do something new and novel, or really try to make, you know, kind of a framework technology or a foundational technology, it isn't this kind of Renaissance man idea of like one really, really smart person is going to just build the next web browser, right? Like maybe that can happen. And there have been things that have come out, especially recently, where it was kind of the solo, you know, genius archetype, which is an archetype I really don't like. But, you know, someone who had an intense curiosity about something and pursued it and made it happen in ways that other people either weren't thinking about or weren't doing. I think the difference for me in that creativity for me is intentional, right?
I agree with that, but
as like, I think a lot of creativity, and I think the bad name creativity gets in that, like, you were born with it, or like, you're just really creative. It's almost like a pejorative now. In my mind sometimes, where it's, you know, it's like you're a creative, meaning my whole setup just went to hell. Are we still here?
I'm here.
Okay. What the hell?
It does look like it's recording on my side.
Okay. All right. Wow. I wish I was like screen recording. This is really weird.
Are you using the browser?
Yeah. Okay. I'm back. Wow. Like apps just started opening up randomly. And then like I lost you, and then I couldn't, you know, see the recording. And
yeah.
I don't know, maybe we'll keep that in. That was kind of a fun tangent.
Your machine has a mind of its own.
Yeah. But so like I guess how I think of creativity is, you know, that it's intentional, right? And that you're going out, you're setting out to do something. It's a little bit of a process. Like, I know people hate the word process too, but there's steps that you go. You have an idea, you try something, you iterate on it, you learn in that iteration that it worked or it didn't work, or it did what you want or it didn't do what you want. And then you kind of end up with some sort of a prototype or a draft, or there's all sorts of words for it, but like, it's maybe not done. And then you look at that in all of the different pieces that have come together and you say, hey, yeah, this is the painting I wanted, or this is the app that I built, or what if I did this, or what if I changed that? And now you're starting to iterate, and you're kind of gaining this momentum of all these little pieces coming into this bigger thing. Whereas I feel like a lot of people think creativity is just this like thing you're born with. And I think like what you might be born with is curiosity. There are people that I know that are insanely curious, and there are people that I know who couldn't be bothered to learn any more about anything that they don't want. And that's totally cool. But like, I think curiosity is also a learnable skill, but I don't think you can be creative without curiosity. And I think people get into this curiosity trap, right? Where it's like, I have this really good idea, and maybe you kind of mentally prototype it. Or I think more commonly you're like, well, I can't do that because, or it won't work because, and maybe that's true and maybe it's not, but you're short circuiting your ability to even try it and learn. Right. And like, I think a good example of this would be like, I could fly. Like, no, I can't. Yeah. Right. There are certain laws of physics that we're just not going to break in my lifetime, but like I could fly in a plane. Right. Or I could maybe get a hand glider, and like prototyping a hand glider is something that I could do in a safe way and learn from. But so many people they get stuck in that first step of they might even be very curious, but then they just never get to that next step. And that's what I find so fascinating about technology in small teams is that you get the right group of people together, you can have all sorts of potential and cool shit that you would never be able to figure out. But I've also seen the exact, opposite of that, where you get the kind of groupthink mentality, and it's almost like the catastrophizing of all of these hypotheticals. And then people kind of like start to, they start to like kind of collapse in on themselves. And then just, they lose that curiosity of doing and failure. And that's something that, I really appreciate with you is you're like, well, I'm just going to go try to figure this out. And you're doing, physical shit. That's hard. Like people like software is hard.
Thanks.
Making stuff in the real world with physics is incredibly difficult, even in 2024.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. And I think that's sort of the mentality that you need to have, right? To what you were saying, that like, oh, I can't do this because it's like, how do you remove those limiting beliefs, right? Because that really is what caps your option space, if we want to go technical, right?
Right.
And then if you get to a point where you recognize all those opportunities and options as opposed to limiters or blockers, then I think the world is a lot bigger, right? Much bigger. But I mean, going back to like your thought about creativity, I'm kind of curious to know where that came from for you, because I'm going to inject a little bit of bias here when I think about people who come from the ML space. Everything's very structured. Everything's very structured. So you kind of stick within your bounds.
Yeah,
right?
That's why they all hate me.
How do you think? I could see. Yeah. But then, so for you, like, how do you, did you develop this, or how do you think you kind of came to realize that you needed this?
That's a really great question. So, I think I've always been just kind of an innately curious person, and like, that's helped. And I think you can develop curiosity and curiousness. There is a bit of persistence, I think, that you need to develop as like a skill. And that's just anything like, we'll call it follow through or time on task or all these kind of words. But like that, there are, I think, parts of like the creative process that it's really easy to get stuck in. And the people who tend to create new things are the people who have the perseverance to sit there and fail and get frustrated and spend sleepless nights. And not that you have to spend sleepless nights to be creative, but there's like just a level of obsession, people call it. And you can learn that, right? And like, but I think also part of the creative process is being able to step back from that and say, I've tried, 30 things, it doesn't work, I'm going to go for a walk. Or, you hear about flow states and that you're, the time kind of melts away because you're so focused on stuff. But I think the creative process, important parts of that are actually time off task just as much as time on task, because your brain neurologically is doing things that we're not probably cognizant of.
Right.
Or you're focusing on something else and you're using different parts of your brain and those other pieces get a rest, or you're making new connections in neurons, of whatever. So again, I think like innately curious, I've learned perseverance over time. I'm not a very patient person, and I don't think I ever will be. But I've kind of learned to work with myself and others through things that like require patience or are a long-term kind of problem that you kind of have to chip away at and break down. I think my interest in curiosity really started. I took a class in college called Creativity and Innovation, I think it was called.
Wow, what a title for
I
a
know,
class.
right? I was kind of like, I needed an art credit. And I was kind of like, well, that's an art credit.
This'll do.
Yeah.
This'll do, yeah.
And I think at the time I might have had a couple majors or a major and a minor, and it like checked all these boxes. And I was like, well, this is the best class ever. I get like all of these, requirements met, and I can take this one class. And I was like, it kind of sounds like a bullshit class, right? Like, I'm like, cool.
Yeah. Fly by.
Yeah, I go to it, and and I think it was like it was a 100 level or 200. It was it's supposed to be kind of an intro. I don't think there was any prereqs for it, and I go into class like the first day, and I think it was a 90-minute like twice a week kind of thing. And we spent 90 minutes talking about the syllabus and the process of how we're going to conduct the class. And I was just like, what the hell am I like in, right? And the professor, Dan Eastman, great guy, has a really strong art background and a couple like MFAs in different things. And he's done all sorts of crazy shit throughout his life. And the whole class was really designed to kind of dig into the creative process and kind of demystify it, because again, from like an arts perspective, you have to learn the tools of what your paintbrushes, your sculpting tools, chisels, hammers, whatever your medium is. And then you learn about the history of the medium. You learn about different techniques that you can use. No one's really teaching you how to do art. They're kind of teaching you all these pieces. And it's up to you to kind of have the idea and the perseverance to do something. And then, there's different styles that people have done, and you kind of explore through that. And then at a master's level, it's people basically pushing you beyond where you're comfortable or pushing you beyond your capability. And that's a good master's program in any university. If it's literature or history or whatever, the person that your professor, is more of a mentor now and is trying to help you fill in the gaps or get you unstuck in the process. So this is, 100 level class. I'm still in my undergrad and I'm in it. And I'm like, this is insane. Right? Yeah. And so there's a couple books that we read. The one that jumps out to me is, it's by Csikszentmihalyi. I think it's called Creativity and Innovation. But he's a psychiatrist, if I recall, and assembled a team, and he interviewed a bunch of creative people, artists, lawyers, presidents, I think, like, successful people. Like, how'd you get there? Business executives. And so he ended up kind of understanding is there's components of commonality across all these disciplines and all these people. And that I think there's another book that's 10 Habits of Highly Effective People or whatever, but it all kind of comes down to like focus and organization and having some sort of mastery and passion, right? Anyway, so I go through this class and I was like, it was really, really cool. It was more philosophy than art. And then we did all sorts of activities in there to kind of force the process. And like, I think one of them was, I love this one. We had to just go pick a rock just on Earth, just pick a rock up. Right. Yeah. And I think the only requirement is that it had to be easily carryable.
Right. Okay.
Right. So, boulder, so we did limit the creativity a little bit.
Sisyphus. Yeah. Sisyphus wasn't part of that class.
Yeah. But then the assignment was to draw something. I think it was like 1,000 or 2,000 drawings of the rock. Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, this is some like master's level art shit, right? Wow. And so we're all in there like, what the hell is this guy smoking, right? And so it's a really, really interesting litmus test, though, in this whole kind of a creative process idea, because I would challenge people to do this because it's actually really, really hard. And, you kind of you throw the rock on the table, you draw a few drawings, and you're like, okay, you flip it over, and you're like, okay, fine. Like I got 20, 50 drawings. Now what? Right. I have 950 to go.
Yeah. That's like the essence of brainstorming, right?
Right.
It's like just whatever comes to you.
And like you get to the point where people got frustrated pretty quick, myself I think included. I'm like, this is dumb.
As anyone would. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And so, but that was like the indication that, okay, I'm stuck. Right. I've done all of the obvious things. I've done all of the things that I could recognize. And so then instead of telling us what to do, which is indicative of most education at this point, he gave us, I hate the word tools, but he gave us strategies or tools to kind of get out of that. Like, how do you change your perspective? Can you change the lighting? Can you focus on shadows? Does your rock have different colors? Are there different shapes? Are there cracks? Like all these kind of things. Wow. And then you start looking at the rock a little bit more and you're like, well, actually, yeah, there's a little divot there. And then when the light hits it this way, it's kind of a crater. And when it hits it this way, it's smooth. And, and so we kind of did that, and you get to a few hundred more and you kind of get stuck again. And then, so the whole point of that was, you're in this cycle of kind of observation and doing and iterating, and you're literally just iterating. At a certain point, you almost are like, well, maybe I should take a shape of the rock, or take a drawing of the rock that I just drew, and I'll draw a representation of that, right? Because there's no rules. And so now it's kind of like a meta perspective. And some people, people are getting into all, like, people take pictures and like all sorts of like, and that's the creative process, right? And maybe it's a really shitty drawing. Maybe it's not something that you would ever keep, but you're really just learning the ability to kind of attack your preconceived notion or get a different perspective on something.
Yeah.
And then it was like, well, what if I draw someone else's rock? There's no rules, right? And so the assignment was picture of a rock, and I think it was framed in like, you can't do that, right? You have to sure. You have to be, but some people tried it, and it was like, okay, yes, that is a creative avenue out of this.
Yeah. You learn how to break the rules. That's also a way of being creative.
Well,
right?
exactly, right?
And
like, I think a lot of creativity is manifest through constraints. That's money, that's time, that's materials,
Absolutely.
And that's where humans, I think, just generally excel. And people don't even realize it. Like, I know people who like build houses and like cabinets and wood stuff and like, trades, I guess is what we kind of call that. And a lot of people don't think that's a creative enterprise. And I was like, these people are out there every day working in shit that doesn't make any sense. The wood is a little warped, or it's a little shorter than you wanted, or it's not quite square, or, and they're solving what's problem solving? Well, problem solving is part of creativity, right? If you're going to solve the problem and you don't have a frame or experience, you have to come up with something new. That's called creativity. Yeah. And it is so mystifying to me to see someone in an arts world, splattering paint on a canvas and calling that creative, and maybe it is. And then people who are like literally like building shit, thinking that it's not creative. And so that whole thing kind of was interesting to me. And then I took another class from the same professor, and I don't remember what it was called, but it was kind of one of these like arty kind of, this was more like art, like making stuff.
Yeah. I mean, after that experience, you take every course that he offers, right?
Exactly. No, 100%. And oh my God, man, he was through the ringer on like the kids just didn't understand. Like, oh, he's picking on me. He's like, no, he's not picking on, this is not personal at all. He's trying to push you to be a better, whatever you're doing. And he's trying to give you, a different perspective.
Managing teams and those words going.
That's probably a whole other thing we could talk about in the future too, is well, and just like people get in their own damn head, and it's just like, you're just making this way too hard, folks. But so I'm in this other class, and I think it was a 3-hour class, but it was like once a week. And so we would have like a little lecture, whatever we were talking about. And then there was some kind of activity or project or something. And then we'd have usually like a homework project.
Like an abstract idea. Yeah.
And one of the assignments we had in class was capturing an image of something. I don't remember exactly. It was some really vague idea. It was like capture an image of the presence of a person without any objects that were related to a person or having a person. Some
Nice.
super abstract kind of meta concept. And so I'll never forget this. I went out and, you know, I don't know, we had like an hour or something to do it. And we had digital cameras at the time, so it was nice. You know, it wasn't about the quality. It was about, you know, capturing your concept and then talking through
as
why.
philosophy is.
And so I went out and I think there was some snow on the ground or mud or something. And I jumped in it and then I got out. And so there was footprints. I take a picture and it was kind of an artistic picture, you know, the sun and like I had some shadowing and it was actually like a good image. I have a background in photography, so I can objectively say that it was a great image.
Nice.
And so I was like, did it, you know, 30 seconds. I run in and I'm like, okay, I did it. And he was kind of surprised, you know, and like, I should get him on here and I'd love to, if he remembers this. I was a pain in the ass, so I'm sure he remembers it. But so I go in, I show him my photo and I'm like, hey, you know, I did it. What's next? And he kind of sits there and he looks at it. And then, you know, there's like a line of people kind of coming in. He asked me a couple questions and, you know, is like, what does this mean? And, you know, just kind of the basic art kind of philosophical questions about stuff. And I, you know, was giving him a bunch of bullshit. And
as philosophy is.
Yeah, I know, right? And well, it's important though. Like that's an important point. And so, you know, there's a line of people, other students and stuff, and he starts kind of showing this to them and they're like, yeah, it's a good photo. I like it. And he's like, yeah, but he's like, this isn't about liking the photo. He's like, what is this? What is this telling you? Like, what is this showing you? And diving deep. And it's like, obviously it's like footprints in the snow or mud or whatever it was. And, you know, but he's like, yeah, but why did you do it? You know, I give him more bullshit. And so he was like, I think I got it. He said, you're clever. He said, but this isn't creative. He didn't say I wasn't creative. He said, this wasn't creative. You are clever. And I think most people now would hear that and probably call it a hate crime or something like, but it was a really interesting, I was like, what the hell do you mean? Right? I'm like, what do you mean? And like, I did the assignment. He's like, the point isn't to do the assignment, right? Like it's the process of doing the assignment to learn shit. Right. And so he's like, if you want to be done, you can be done. Like you did it. However, I would challenge you to, and you know, he gave me some feedback and I was like, okay, fuck this guy, you know, I did the damn thing. But then I kind of thought about it a little bit and I really thought about clever versus creative. And I think I went back up, I did another image and I asked him, I was like, what do you mean by that? And I think it's a really interesting topic, which again, I think probably deserves its own time, but like, I would just kind of summarize it as cleverness is like an immediate adaptation given like a set of circumstance or being able to quickly, you know, describe something or give detail or something like that. Whereas creativity can be clever, but creativity is very intentional.
Yeah. I was going to bring it back there.
Yeah.
Like there's some intentionality.
And it's not typically the first shot, right? You typically don't set out to do something creatively and then you just get it done and it's done. Sometimes it happens that way and you're like, oh, this is really great. But like typically it's a process and you're intentionally changing things or you're intentionally adding or removing or whatever, you know, you're kind of experimenting with to do something. And I hadn't done that, right? I just came up with like, yeah, it was a great image, you know, like, I don't know if I'd like put it on a wall, but like it was cool. It was interesting. It had all the criteria, but it wasn't actually creative because I didn't intentionally do it. Like the intention was almost to just like quickly get the assignment done. Right. And fine. You know, again, creativity doesn't really have rules. So technically, yes, creative. However, I was like, you know, kind of shortchanging myself, so to speak, on the creative process. And so then he gave me some feedback, went on, did another one. And then I was like, oh, this is actually kind of fun because every time you'd go back, he'd give you some challenge or he'd like make a limitation, you know, like, great, you can't use a down angle or you can't use a building or you know, whatever. And it's like, okay, try something else. And so I think that was like, I think I have the story flipped. I think that class was first and then I took creativity and innovation. Because I was really mad. I remember being really, really mad in the first time around because I was like, this is dumb. I just want I want all my credit. I'm in college. I just want to be done.
Yeah.
So that's really where I got into it. And then throughout my career, I just don't see it differently. Like people call it brainstorming, people call it, execution, and it's all parts of that process. And I think going deeper into that process at some point would be good for folks because and I think it just fundamentally comes down to being curious, trying to get to a basic enough understanding or a basic enough starting point to get started, and then adding in. And that it's not like creativity is also nonlinear. And I think that really breaks people's minds a lot too. Cause maybe I give you a half painted painting and then you start painting on it. People have done collaborative painting, I'm sure, and understand that. Technology is the same way. Like, oh, I built this, really cool filter for something. Oh yeah, I'll take that and I'll iterate on it. So in software, It's like a given, right? Open source, and like most people are pretty forthcoming with ideas and willing to collaborate and share. In the rest of the business world, the businesses that are really successful do that. But when you get to a certain point, you stop doing that, and then you become unsuccessful, and then you kind of atrophy and die. And it's been so fascinating for me in my career because I've had feet in the arts world, I've had feet in the technology world, I've been in business, I've been in all these other different industries, and from like a high level kind of abstract perspective, it's all the same kind of stuff that people are dealing with in a different vertical. And that's kind of the whole point of this podcast, is to try to break some of that down, because I think people feel isolated in their stuckness sometimes. And part of creativity is different perspective. So if I'm listening to you talking about microgrids and you came up with some problem you had to solve, maybe that helps me. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know. But I think like without exposing yourself to it, you don't actually know.
Yeah.
And that's part of curiosity too. You have to like seek it. And I've tried to find stuff like this and I haven't been super successful. And so I was like, I'll start it. See what happens.
Yeah. I mean, there are lots of overlaps here, right? I think like as you're talking about creativity and doing the exercise versus just getting it done, there's like a balance between like the infinite battle between like the process versus the outcome, right?
Yeah.
And there's a parallel there, but in that being able to go through the process versus trying to come up with an outcome, I think a lot of those mentalities also kind of roll over into entrepreneurship, which is kind of something that you're branching off into, right? It's like being able to have that perspective of dealing with whatever comes or figuring out what limitations you have and trying to work with it. Yeah. Right.
We should probably mention that you have neighbors who appreciate loud music.
Well, I mean, one of the nice things about here in Puerto Rico is that they're very proud of their music culture here. Yeah. So you'll find people driving by and blasting their music. So I apologize if you hear some of that.
It's all good. Through. As long as we don't get a copyright strike, I'm okay with it.
Yeah. But I mean that's what I wanted to highlight, right? Yeah. It's like you're not finding this thing that you're looking for, but over your lifetime, you've built up this sort of tenacity or discipline to go out there and expose and do it yourself or kind of figure it out on your own. And that's the reason we're here.
Yeah. And I think too, like it's really hard. The podcasting space, the modern media landscape is dominated with these like talking head personality people, or they're people who have done stuff. But it's also like it's the same people with the same kind of stories, and it's the same format. And like that rut is there, that the rut is good in that it creates a format and a pattern that people can pick up on and recognize. But I think it's also detrimental in a lot of ways because it makes it easy pattern recognize. The interview, we're going to do an ad sponsor. It's kind of my routine. I've learned something. It's intellectual. And like, I go on about my life, and like at a certain skill level, like you can learn intellectually from other people and not have to reproduce their, mistakes or trials or whatever. But I also think a lot of people overestimate their mastery of a skill set.
Dr. Kruger.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so like you get, again, kind of stuck into this, like, you know, oh, that's really cool, I could do that. And then you don't, or, oh, that's really hard and I won't try it. And again, like, that's what I love when we were chatting about this whole microgrid. I think I remember telling you, I was like, dude, this is really fucking hard.
Yeah, like, you don't got to tell me that.
You're on hard mode, but you're like, yeah, I know, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I was like, okay, like, let me know how it goes. And then, I think we chatted a little bit later and you're like, yeah, well, I'm looking to buy land. I think it was in Indonesia or something, right? And I was just like,
that was the first place I checked.
Yeah. And I was like, that's random. Why don't you tell me a little bit about that? And I think a lot of people listening might say, well, that's crazy. Well, yeah, maybe it's a little crazy, but you can start in a smaller step, and like you'd already done a lot of homework and I know looked around the US and found all sorts of, I think it was expense was the biggest thing, right? It was like just buying property is expensive here, and then trying to do permits and all this shit is impossible. And the regulatory environment is great because it keeps people safe, but it also kind of hurts innovation and creativity.
Exactly. Right. Exactly.
I know we kind of touched a little bit on AI, but maybe like, I think this is a really, I think, a good crossover. And if people haven't figured it out yet, there's no structure, and there never will be a structure to this podcast, right? It's literally going to be people talking about interesting shit. I should maybe get a bleep button or something, because I want people to.
They don't knock you for that, do they? For cussing?
Technically, well, I don't know what constitutes cussing anymore either.
Exactly.
Some of the stuff people say that isn't cussing is more offensive to me than things that
the actual
are
right,
cussing.
exactly.
But I have to probably censor it a little bit. I don't want to, kids are listening, whatever. I don't know. I think that'd be a great, the whole word thing. That's a better segue. Yeah. Like, I think we're talking a little bit about this, but like my number one fear is that people are going to like take stuff out of context, and it happens all the time online. Right. And like, the whole point of this is to have a free form exchange of ideas. And sometimes ideas are bad. Sometimes they're not the idea that you want. Sometimes you might find it offensive. That's okay. Like, nobody should be trying to offend you. But if you find yourself reacting in a negative way to something, like, that's okay. You don't have to do it. You don't have to support it. But this like, we've weaponized this recently in our culture of like, you have to then like take down the person who's platforming or the person who's, and like, it's so integral in creativity to fail. Yeah. And fail can be, I set out to do a thing and it didn't work the way I want. Failure could be, I said the wrong thing in the wrong way. The failure could be, I said something that I didn't realize was offensive or profane or something, and it's like being able to do that and then maybe be gently corrected, be like, hey, I was really offended by this thing you said, okay, learning moment. But we've taken that framework and then weaponized it. And to me, that is like just so unacceptable in society, in life. And like, yes, you just have asshole people in the world and we need a better way to deal with them. But most people are not that, right? Most people are not out there spewing hate or trying to be offensive. And part of the creative process is screwing up a lot. And if you screw up in private, you might not know even. And being able to do it in a public space, being able to do it collaboratively with people, like the number one thing people tell me when I ask them to be on the podcast is like, well, what if this is used against me? I'm like,
wow,
that sucks. Like, I don't know what else to say.
Wait, hold on. Is it weird that I didn't even think about that?
Maybe. Yeah, just so you know, you're going to get canceled. But no, like, I have a friend who will be on next after this, and we were talking through it, and especially in business, like, I want people to talk about their profession, and I've gotten this from, I think, literally everybody other than maybe a couple people. I don't have maybe a dozen people kind of lined up. But like, what if my employer hears this, or what if other employers hear it? And like my response to that was honestly like, well, then you probably don't want to work with them anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Like, I mean, if you're on here like spewing, crazy racist shit, like I'm not going to publish it, number one, but number two, like that is not at all like where we're at. But
well, why are you friends with these people?
I know. Well, exactly. Well, I mean, I'm getting to the point now where I'm even starting to get people I don't know, which is cool.
Yeah.
But
nice.
Or I like loosely know, and that's fine. But like, I don't expect any of that to happen. But I can totally see, especially as time goes on, what we talk about now is not going to be in vogue in 2 years or 6 years or whatever, right? And like this retroactive punitive lens coupled with you can't make mistakes is just terrifying to me, because like we're already having a problem with curiosity and creativity and innovating new ideas. And now we've made the public space so toxic that nobody really wants to be out there and trying. And the worst thing I think you can do other than that is to not do things in public. I know we've talked a lot about this, like when I'm, in professional environments or whatever, I prefer to work in public as much as possible and have my team. And like, yes, there's always, business secrets or stuff like that. But like, I have a pretty high scrutiny for like, no, actually put that in a public channel or put that in an email, right? Like it shouldn't matter. Like that's the only way that we're actually going to understand if this is the right approach or perspective is to get other people's input on it. Right.
Right.
And if that doesn't happen, you lose like this huge innovation landscape, because everyone, this going back to kind of the idea of like a solo genius, like, yes, those people do exist, but for the most part, they don't. And even it's even a myth, because anything you pick up from knowledge, from past human experience, is past human experience that was shared, right? It's not like you were born in a bubble and you were just so brilliant. You taught yourself language and math and all this shit.
On the shoulder of giants.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
And it's so integral to the process. But when you shut that down, you lose out on that. And like, it's the privatization in corporations versus, public government idea. And I just see more and more of it. And this is an attempt to try to get out of that. But then I have people who have very real, concerns. And the only thing I can tell them is like, again, like any negative consequences from you sharing what you're doing or sharing your perspective on things, in my mind, is just kind of like an indication of failure. Like those people have failed to be accepted. Right. And I do think there's like when people demonstrate over and over and over again that they are in a, like racism comes to mind, that, you just hate people based on a characteristic. Okay. That's a different problem, but most of what I'm seeing and most of what I encounter is not that.
Yeah.
And so it just, and the only way I know how to deal with that is to just put up a platform and maybe take some of that and be that critical voice. Cause again, I'm a technologist. I have a product background. I have an engineering background too, but I live mostly in product land. A good product is built by getting all the perspectives. And a lot of times in professional life, I find myself having to take a contra perspective. Steel manning is a kind of a word people use, or devil's advocate. And again, it's not a malicious intent, but it's like we have to make sure that we've thought about what could be the inverse of what we're trying to do. And in a lot of technology, we don't have that, which is how you get, AI systems that make Black Nazis. Google put out a generative AI image generator, and someone asked it, give me pictures of diverse Nazis. And of course, Nazis were exclusively white. That was a huge part of the ideology for people who don't know. Hopefully you do, but just in case you don't know.
Just in case.
Being white, blonde hair, blue eye was like the ideal Nazi kind of perspective. And to have anything other than that depicted is, I think, quite offensive to a lot of people, myself included, but also just like wrong, right? This is a factual part of history that should be represented in a way. And if you're doing a creative, piece or something, I don't want to say like you could never have a picture of a Black Nazi and make a point, but it needs to be framed in that right perspective of making that point. Right.
Yeah.
And this was just Google, trying to do some, diversity filter on their language model. And then they shut it down. I mean, this was out there if folks want to read more about it. But I think that's just like a primary example of like trying to do the right thing by representing non-white people in images, but then having an unintended consequence of what if I ask it a question that it should return a white person or a black person or, Asian person or whatever. Right. And I remember kind of, again, tying this back to AI, because I really do want to talk about AI a little bit.
Yeah.
One of the things I did in the past was AI stuff. I can't get into it too much, but the actual requirement for, and this was years ago. This was before ChatGPT was all the rage. And one of the things I told the team was like, this thing can't deny the Holocaust, because at the time, I think it was ChatGPT 3 or something. Like, nobody knew about this stuff outside of the tech world, right?
I recall this.
Yeah,
right.
But someone was talking to it and got it to deny the Holocaust and like all this stuff, and like, and it kind of made headlines in certain news cycles. And I was like, and they thought I was joking, and I was like, no, seriously, like I don't want our AI to deny the Holocaust. Like, it happened. And this was not the point of the AI for folks, but the part of the problem with AI in its generative nature is that it does things that you can't predict. And so it is very possible that we put this technology in front of people and somebody tries to either just do this for like a joke or for a nefarious reason. And I was like, look, this is going to be my test. You put this AI in front of me. I'm going to try to do everything I can to make this thing say stuff that it shouldn't. And they're like, well, we really can't protect against that. Like, there are strategies and solutions, but it gets really, complicated and technical. I don't really want to get into that. But from my perspective as a product person, we needed to represent, because it was, this is really cool technology, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, it is. It's really great technology. But at the same time, we have to have that critical thought. We have to have adversarial perspectives to make sure that we're building not only the best thing we can, but also thinking about contraindications, a lot of times they'll be called. And that's really hard, because it's like, how do you, hypothesize all the things that you're not intending to do? Yeah, and that becomes its own kind of unknowns. Yeah, that kind of becomes its own problem set. But even as time has progressed, I've seen these types of conversations not being had in large companies because people are afraid. Like, nobody wants to talk about denying the Holocaust. Well, no, I don't either. But like, it's a thing people do. And it's a thing people try to make your technology. It's a very real problem that is easy to test and kind of solve for. But at the same time, it's like, we've even shut that down. And then we keep seeing, it's like, it feels like every other day now. And I follow this stuff pretty closely, but some AI does some other crazy thing that, we find socially inappropriate or morally inappropriate.
Blasphemy. Right.
Yeah. And I kind of have to wonder, like, how much of this is just because we've shut down this discourse, or we're too afraid to put out an idea and say, like, what if it did this? Or like, is this a problem we should look at? Like, is this even conceivable? And it's like suffering in silence, right? It's like, from the psychological perspective, it's really easy to just ruminate on your own problems. But when you talk to someone else, they're like, yeah, like, how can I help? And you're like, what, you want to help me? And now you're in a pathway to get out of it. So I don't know. That was kind of like a rant kind of story, but like, I don't know. What are your thoughts on
it
on
ties
that?
back to everything we've been talking about. It ties back, right? Because it's like the fear of feeling uncomfortable, right? When people have these hard conversations, not wanting to have those hard conversations, or feeling offended or whatever, right? But that open discourse is kind of required to produce that creativity, the exploration of the idea. Yeah. And you may come to the conclusion that, I was offended, or that was wrong, but people don't even ask that initial question of like, why? Or
and I think that's the important part, is like trying to avoid being offended or unhappy or, sad or whatever, has ramifications in ways that you might not understand. But then you never get to the root of, why were you offended, or why is that offensive? And maybe it's not. Maybe you totally misunderstood the context. Maybe it is offensive, right? And you can understand why that is. Like, I will just, I guess, for the record, state, I have said all sorts of crazy shit to people that I shouldn't have, that I didn't at the time know was something I shouldn't say, right? Like, anybody who's experienced another culture, or, even within the United States, localities have different ideas of acceptable behavior. And I will say most of the time, more often than not, I would say 90-95% of the time, someone like just said like, hey, that's not cool, or hey, we don't say that, or, and gave me some context. And I was like, I'm sorry, like immediately, like I didn't even realize that, that was something that, you had a negative reaction to. And then I learned from it. And you don't learn if you don't have that instance, and I've also had we don't say that. I'm like, but why? Like, I don't think it's that big of a deal, right? Like, why can't we say that? And then someone will give you the context. You're like, oh, okay, I understand that.
Yeah, and it goes both ways, right? It's not just the individual person who does the mistake; it's how other people respond to that.
Yeah,
right? That's where the fear comes in. You don't want to say the wrong thing and be physically attacked for it, right?
And I've talked to some folks, and I'm hoping to get them on the pod about like the modern education system and like art specifically, and trying to get people to just make mistakes, because everybody wants to be perfect first out the gate. That's just not how it works. Like even the most skilled person is usually not perfect every time. Like, I mean, sports is a great example of this, right? A lot of people get paid to play sports, and that's all they do. They train for it, they practice, and they still make mistakes. And that's how a game is won or lost. Or that's like the fun of watching the game. Like nobody, I don't think, is really watching the game to see the mistake and then, ruminate on it and like, you dropped the ball, you failed. But the lack of execution is what makes sports fun, right? Like, I remember reading a thing about golf, right? Where someone was like, you have a tiny little stick and you have a tiny little ball and you put a tiny little hole as far away as you possibly can. Like, that's not fun, right? That should not be fun. But the challenge of doing it with those constraints, which is similar to creativity, but then also not being able to do it. If you could just hit the ball in the hole every single time, nobody would probably play it. It wouldn't be that fun. Or you'd play it a couple times, you'd be like, okay, great, I'm going to go, do this other thing. Yeah. And so it's interesting. It's so interesting to me that all of this stuff is baked into like everything we do as people. But then we create these weird constraints and conditions in our society that, like the Enlightenment is a great example of how humanity flourished just unbelievably in a small amount of time because people were able to question stuff. Mm-hmm. And then people either prove them right or prove them wrong, right? Using science, right? So like, okay, the world's flat. Well, we're going to devise some experiments. Oh, it turns out it's not. Here's the evidence. If you can dispute that evidence, and it's not saying you're wrong. I mean, I'm sure there was some of that. But, but the whole point of this is that you're attacking the idea, or you're attacking the process, or you're attacking a detail of something and not the person. And I've just also seen that switch flipped. And I think that's where this like word games that everybody plays is really about them. But it's like, you don't understand that you're actually undermining our entire like human ability to do crazy shit. Humans do crazy shit all the time. Some of it's great, some of it's not so great. But like, I mean, we put people on the moon for fuck's sake, right? Like, that's nuts. Like, we literally left the planet because we're like, I don't know, could we do it? Right? And like, and I know we've talked about, I want to see that happen again. Not necessarily going to the moon, but like, these big audacious, things that seem very implausible. With the right amount of people and the right people focusing on them, you might not achieve it, but you're going to learn all sorts of stuff that is applicable to the rest of our society.
Absolutely. Right. It's that learning piece, I think, is because what you're starting to do with that is, the four known unknowns and the four quadrants, right? That known unknown space is so much larger than the known knowns, right? Yeah. And being curious and doing stuff to sort of pick away at the unknown unknowns is, even if you fail, you sort of remove a little bit from the unknown unknowns, right? Yeah. And I think that's kind of what we need as a society to keep progressing and to move forward. And honestly, that's probably the fun part too, for the people who can handle it, I think.
Yeah, and I think like aversion to failure is like maybe number one or number two problems with creativity too. Is like people put a lot of pressure on themselves. And then the pressure from other people amplifies through that. And then people like don't want to do it, or they're afraid of what happens. And then we create sometimes environments that are very like negative are very failure resistant. And like sometimes failure is bad. When you fly on a plane, you don't want the engine to fail. Right?
Right.
I mean, you have 3 more usually, but probably bad, right?
Yeah. Just in general. Yeah.
But at the same time, that engine failure, you want the person investigating that or the team investigating that to understand why it failed.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the people who built it are probably the best equipped to do that. So you don't want to just fire them because the engine failed. You want to say, okay, the engine failed. How do we make sure this doesn't happen again? Or how do we learn from this to make a better part or a better engine? Or, you know, I'm sure you've seen this on social media, but there's a graphic. I don't even know if this is a true story, but it's brilliant visualization of this point of World War II, and the planes were coming back from bombing Germany. They're all shot up, and like, you know, some of them never came back,
the
and
bullet holes.
some of them came back,
the
and
whole story.
There's, you know, they started to notice these patterns of where all these bullet holes were. And one of the plane manufacturers went to their engineer and be like, how do we make the planes better? Because, you know, repairing the plane is expensive, or they make the plane makes it back, but it can't fly again. They can't repair it. You know, how do we fix it? We just put armor all these places. And allegedly the engineer, or the team most likely, right, looked at it and said, that's the other thing, like this mythos of single genius.
Creativity.
Well, but this mythos of the engineer, you know, and I'm like, you know, thousands of people.
Probably simplified for
but like thousands of people have to make a plane, right? Even back then, and they were much simpler. But this mythos of this brilliant person who just knows all this stuff, and this is so American, you know, the hero. But like, I'm sure it was a team of people looked at it and they said, well, but what if this isn't critical to the plane? What if it's the stuff that wasn't hit that was critical? And what if we armored that better or made it redundant so that the other planes would come back? And allegedly, I don't know, it was like a 20% success rate after that. You know, it's like they saw massive gains. And it's kind of a divergent thinking idea, but I think it's also just a first principles of like looking at the problem and asking, well, why are they actually coming back? Right now, the bullet holes are irrelevant. Like what is required to make this plane fly and get it back, and what's there versus what isn't there or shot out or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And that ties to that curiosity question of asking that why are these ones coming back, or that leads to that.
And like when I run a team, like I guess in product world, for folks who don't know, the product manager is typically like in charge of the team. They are there to make sure that the business does their thing, makes money, or you know, whatever the objective is, typically money. Make sure that the customer needs are represented and solved for, and then the engineering team and design and whoever else comes in and you know, builds the thing. But when I run a team, initially I found it really hard to like have a failure accepted environment, because there's, you know, this idea of fail fast that's out there in tech world too, and I hate that because it's like it makes it sound like I feel like it gets back to that clever versus curious, and creative, where it's like fail fast, you just throw a bunch of stuff at the wall, and you know, maybe it works, maybe it sticks, maybe it'll be fine. But I'm like, that's not what you want either. You want a well-informed hypothesis or an idea of what you're trying to accomplish. You want to do that, but you want to do it in such a way that if it doesn't work or it doesn't do what you think, you learn as fast as possible that it isn't doing what you want. And again, for folks who don't really familiar with technology, like a lot of teams fail spectacularly because they don't get in front of the customer. They ruminate on problems and they hypothesize solutions and hypothesize new problems. And then you just get this massive, gross thing that's never actually seen a customer interaction, or it's not being used by the customer in the way that they want to use the thing, or the way that they always use the thing. And so you don't actually get that information, and then you run out of money, or your company goes bankrupt, or whatever. You get fired, you know, you didn't produce anything. But yeah, it's something that it was really hard for me initially. And then I found that it's also really hard to instill. I had a team that was mixed.
The culture or the mindset?
I think both.
Or I guess they're both tied together. I guess.
Because it's like I can fail fine, but I don't want to fail in front of my peers, or I don't want to fail on the team.
Yeah,
I don't want to let the team down. And no, nobody wants that either. But you're going to let the team down much worse if you don't actually understand your contribution isn't working. Right. Yeah. If you fail, okay, yep. Sorry, folks, this doesn't work. Like, I need help, or here's an idea that I'm going to try next, or whatever, like that would be the best way I think to go about it. But I had a diverse team of it was cross-functional for business word people out there.
Keyword.
And it was also like cross-experiential. So there was a lot of like younger folks who were maybe first job or second job kind of out of college. And some people weren't in college. And then there was some highly, highly experienced people and kind of everywhere in between. And it was cross-functional. So it was multidisciplinary. And this is like the world's worst problem for most people, right? Is it's like all of the
everything,
hard things to do in one team. And there's that's probably a whole nother cast in itself too. But like the thing that kind of relates to what we're talking about was that I found very quickly that it was really hard to get people to talk through failure, partly because there was a company culture problem. Part of it was, I think a lot of people had been in bad environments or with bad managers who punish failure. And like, sometimes you have to punish failure. Like if you're in charge of making the plane stay up and it doesn't stay up, then
makes sense. Yeah.
And if there was things you should have done or could have done that you didn't, then you probably don't exist anymore. But in most instances, like, and what I usually tell my teams is that we want to fail fast so that we know, so that we don't get to that point. And I think that's the biggest problem with failure is like people try to hide it, or they don't ask the hard questions, or they don't push themselves. And then you find out at the very end. You want to find out as soon as you can in the beginning. Mm-hmm. But it was so hard to get these folks to do that. Partly, I think, because they didn't trust each other. They were different teams with different priorities. So I had to kind of create like a common culture almost within the team. And it wasn't separate from the company, but it was like, here's our rules, here's how we play. And then there was a lot of like trust building with folks. And what I ended up having to do is also, I think, just like do it with people. Like I would screw up and I would be like, I screwed up. And people would be like, you don't say that on a meeting. I'm like, I just did. But it's okay, right? It's okay to make mistakes as long as you catch them and they don't, snowball. And I think like, there are some unexcusable mistakes where you lose your job. Like for folks listening, like, yes, this is not some altruistic world where you just get to fuck up as much as you want. But most people and most of the time, if you understand something isn't working and then give some indication as to why, and then have an idea or hypothesis for something else you can try, will almost universally be okay. Mm. And I think a lot of people will get to that point of failure and be like, no, I failed. And it's like, okay, that's not helpful, right? Okay, great, you failed. Like, we know that. But like, what are you doing next? Or like, what do you need help with? And they don't take it that next step. And like, then people get mad, or they get, feelings, emotions, all sorts of stuff starts to happen. But if you can just follow that simple formula, I think most of the time you come out okay. Mm. But if you're in an environment where just failure is punitive, period, like it's very, very difficult to correct for that. And that's why I think like small teams are good in being insular from some of those problems. But, like, again, this should probably just be a whole topic because
I mean, there's so many questions to go from here. But I mean, do you think that was like an isolated experience where you were able to do something like that? Okay. Good.
Yeah, that's what I get. Come up with that's process, the clever versus right. That's the clever versus the intentional. I thought it was, and I did it again a couple times. So it's not. Nice. It's just because I think part of it's an interesting thing you said that, because like I've done some interviews for jobs where people ask me like kind of like, could you do it again? Or
so we're gonna wait for the book, right? This is how you do it. This is how you do it.
But like, it is incredibly simple, right? I just explained it, right? You make a shared culture. You exhibit the qualities that you want other people on the team to exhibit, and you protect that. So if someone is yelling at someone in a meeting, or you shut them down. Like, and I had to do that a lot, where it was just like, you don't get to say that, or you don't get to speak. Like, it's their turn, or that's not constructive. And then it's a lot of one-on-one time with people too, where I'm just like, hey, and sometimes it's removing people. Like, hey, you're just not working out. Like, sorry, like go do something else. You're not on the team anymore. Maybe you're fired, maybe you're not. Like, I'm not saying you have to get fired, but and sometimes people just don't fit on a team, and that's okay too, right? Like, I think people hear that and then their experience is different, or they failed in doing that before, or they know other people. And so, like, the problem I see a lot in, especially interviewing land, is that there are so many, they used to call them smooth talkers or slick talkers, right? Where they have these ideas and they'll present this like philosophical or ideological
look at
thing.
Buy-ins. And,
but they've never actually done it, or they did it once.
Right, exactly.
And I think that's the most scary for me, as someone who's done it once, because then they think that, well, I don't want to speak in overgeneralizations, but this has been my experience, and I think everybody probably agrees. They do it once one way, and then they try to do it the same way again.
Yeah, they use that as the hammer for everything else.
Yeah, and they don't understand that all of the variables are different, right? If I even went back to the same company and tried to do this again, I mean, maybe it would be successful. I would like to think it would be, but it's different people, different time, different experience, different problem, different goal, like whatever. Yeah. But the formula is very simple. It's the execution that's always hard. And like, I'm building a software product, and I talk to people about it all the time, and I they're like, "Oh, you're just sharing your ideas." I'm like, "Yeah, ideas are easy.
Yeah,
it's making it happen. That's the hard part, and that's where I excel. That's the journey. Right? Yeah, like like operators, or operations a little different, but like operating, or the executive function of making it happen, is the challenging part, and it's also very difficult to judge. And again, like, yeah, maybe you were super successful at 3 companies before, but the mix at company 5 is just not it. Yeah. And you could do all the right things, and you could say all the right things, and you could still fail. And then people see that as a total career, and it's this weird, like, again, it's like, you don't want to hire people, you don't want to work with people who are failing all the time. That's bad. Right. You need to make progress, and you need to not repeat the same mistakes. And I think people mix that up too with failure. It's like, if you're always late and failing to show to meetings on time, that's a problem. If you're late because you got in a car accident, I would say, why are you still here? Like, why are you not attending to your life? But like, okay, something you can't really control, or your alarm didn't go off, or your power was up, right? Like, infrequent failures are fine. And when you learn from it and say, oh, my power went out, my alarm clock didn't work, now I have a battery power clock. Okay, great. You've tried something else. And maybe the battery goes dead and the power goes out and you're still late. Like, okay, that shit happens, right? But like, you're demonstrating progress towards improving or solving for the condition, and you have the awareness of what happened. And maybe, alarm clocks are bad, and the better way to do it is to have your neighbor come knock on your door, right? Like, a totally different process. And I mean, this is ridiculous, but everybody should be able to relate to this idea. And it's just so easy to kill that, and it's so hard to repair it, that when you actually do kind of get this kind of ball rolling or whatever, you have to guard it with like an immense curiosity, because that one negative voice can be bad. But then people, I think, take it too far to say, well, I don't want to criticize anything because I don't want to be negative. Well, criticizing an idea and presenting alternative hypotheses or questions about, like, did you think of this, or what if this happened, in a scoped and shaped way, are productive. When that's all you're doing all day long, nope, you got a problem you need to fix yourself, because you don't want to just shit on everyone else's ideas all the time. It's just this multi-lever balancing act that is really difficult. And so it's like, kind of going back, it's like, it's really easy to talk about this stuff, but it's executing on it, which is really, really hard, which is why I love talking with other people in different fields, because everyone goes through this. And I think exposing people to a lot of different perceptions of different ideas, different problems,
Absolutely.
people will start to see, so that's why, and I love this,
Yeah.
but, yeah, it wasn't really a lot of AI talk there, but we got kind of
no, but I think that point you just struck on right then and there, right? And that's why I think what you're building here and what you're focusing on is effectively that in its essence, right? Because you're taking things from art and technology and all these different spaces, but there are these, call them first principles or overarching themes or things that you'll see all over the place. It's all about the human experience, and we all experience similar things in different places, right?
Yeah,
and it's drawing the line between all of those, which I think is not done enough, right? And some of that is lack of curiosity or lack of appreciation, but I think we need that, and that's why I love what you're doing, man.
Yeah, I'm gonna try a segue.
All right, let's do it.
Because I think this.
Let's draw the diagram to get there.
I think this kind of. Well, I think I think the pattern that people have to get out of is like, especially as you get older, you learn, and your brain creates all these association and connections. Like you can't teach an old dog new tricks; it's false. But it's really hard.
Fluid intelligence.
Yeah, because that dog is like, I get up and I get my bone and I eat and I'm done. Right? I'm not going to go play fetch. Like screw you, human. But you can. It's just it takes more time, and I think humans are the same way. And as you get older, I feel like you lose curiosity. One, because you like know more stuff.
Yeah.
And you've been exposed to more stuff. And it's so easy. And I do this a lot. And I've had people call me on it, and I appreciate them for it. That I'll kind of like shoot down an idea, or I'll be like, well, we can't do that because, and it's usually a really good reason, or it's a really, it's an observation that, but it's like, but we also didn't do it. And the hardest thing I think for me when I run a team is to like know from experience or from other evidence that like what we're doing is maybe not the right thing, but also letting it go forward, knowing that it's a learning opportunity, and not necessarily like I'm teaching someone a lesson, but it's like, we're going to try this thing. I don't think it's going to work because of evidence.
Yeah.
I might be wrong, number one. And number two, through the process of doing that, we might actually invent something better.
Yeah.
And so what I've kind of started to adapt to is I'll talk to whomever or the team or whatever, and I'll say like, hey, in past experience, or here's, my evidence. And it's usually pretty good. Like I'm not perfect, but like, I'm not just going to come out of left field and be like, we can't do this. And then, having a conversation and dialogue about it. And then you usually get counter perspectives, or I'll oftentimes too, like kind of gut react where if someone's really passionate about it and you're giving them all the evidence and they're just like, no, this will work. Or I am, they just full on believe in it. Sometimes you just let it run.
Way. Yeah. You got to learn.
Yeah. And I would say I've had, both instances a lot where they'll say, yep, you were right. We have to pivot or whatever. Or they'll say, hey, no, you were wrong, which is great. Or they'll say, well, it wasn't working, but, and then the but is usually the really interesting part, because it was either like, it's usually like, in my experience, it's 2 steps beyond what you thought was even possible. You're trying to do, step 1 and you're like, I can't do it, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And then someone will come up with some creative solution that'll just kind of unlock this whole new, like, tech tree or something, like in a video game.
Yeah.
You unlocked air travel. Now you can like fly planes and eventually go to space. Right. And it's impossible to predict that. And it's really hard to, in a business environment, especially, operate this way, because business people don't understand that. And it's always, how do you know? Well, it's like, oftentimes you don't, but it's going back to fail quick. And how do you fail quick? Well, you set out, right. But you set out known parameters, right? Or an objective, KRs, like, there's all KPIs, there's all this kind of stuff to measure. And you measure that frequently. And a lot of the conversation I have with teams is oftentimes like, are we hitting what we think we're hitting? No. Okay, well, do we stop? Do we try something different? Or sometimes do we keep going? Like, we're just like, we just don't think we've spent enough time on the problem. we haven't really made progress, but we also are still learning, or we're still have other things to try. And it's a judgment call, and it's really hard to train that. And it's really difficult to report that out in a corporate structure because people just don't have the context and don't want the context, which is a problem.
Absolutely.
But it's interesting because like I see this, like as I've gotten older, I've also susceptible to all this stuff. I've learned more, and you kind of get stuck in my ways, so to speak, and I have preferences and this kind of stuff. But like I think a lot about like neuroplasticity, and it used to be thought that like you developed X amount of brain cells and then they were there forever.
That was it.
Yeah. And then
no such thing as neurogenesis.
Yeah, exactly. And then we kind of learned where it's like, well, actually these things do kind of and I don't remember enough about neuroscience, but like some of it's there baked in forever, but then you're constantly regenerating cells and making new connections.
Yeah,
and
right.
The new connections you're making can make up for the things that have died over time, or brain trauma or alcohol or whatever.
Yeah.
And it used to kind of be this idea too, that like you can't learn new things as you get older. Well, no, it's just harder because those connections are there, or you lose curiosity or society or stress or whatever the fucking problems are. And just kind of thinking that, I know we've talked a lot about neuro stuff, and I know and like how sleep is really important. And I would love to do a sleep cast with you, just like specifically focused on that, because I'm like a sleep junkie now.
Wait, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I think you're both.
Yeah. No, it's good.
A sleep knowledge junkie.
No, I'm a sleep junkie. I'm all for sleep.
Oh, okay.
Huge supporter of sleep.
I am as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess like I used to not sleep a lot, or stay up late, or, irregular sleep schedule. And I think we were chatting, and one of the things we started talking about is Oura Ring once upon a time. Yeah. I've been day one subscriber. It's not sponsored, but it probably should be.
I mean, you got me to get one.
I know.
So
I'm like I've been such an evangelist for that company, but it's such a great product. And it's a ring that tracks your sleep. It tracks your activity level, heart rate, blood oxygen, like all this kind of stats. And everyone always asks me, like, what do you get from that? And one thing I learned is that, the patterns of knowledge are real, right? If you don't have a sleep schedule, you sleep worse, and you feel more tired, and you get more stressed and more irritable and all this stuff. And I have also found that like I can kind of predict when I'm sick or when my body is fatigued in ways that I don't expect. So like I was sick a few months ago, and I saw it in the ring. My body temperature was up, less deep sleep, more light sleep and REM. And so like that got me into all sorts. I have an 8 sleep mattress, so that heats and cools overnight, which is also, supposed to help. And I've always skeptical of these claims, but then I started like applying them and try to improvements for data. And like if I eat or drink after like 8 o'clock at night, I have a measurable less sleep quality.
Right. Yeah.
It's even common. Water.
Yeah, it's common.
Yeah, if I drink water at like 8:30 or 9, I'm like,
wow. Okay.
Yeah. No, it's really, it's not like I'm like waking up. It's just like my physiology or whatever doesn't do as well with nighttime digestion or whatever it is.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know. Do you have any like new insights into, and we can go, and I should be really clear too, like the technology doesn't fucking matter. Like the number one thing you can do for sleep improvement is like cool, dark place and have a schedule. And if you can't do any of it, have a schedule.
Yeah. I mean, there are so many ways we can take this, right? Like one is like the whole wearable space. And then 2 is like keeping it simple, right? We're in an age where we're getting so much more. Yeah. We're getting so much more information, and this obsession with like the quantified self and capturing all this data about yourself. Like sometimes more information's worse, right? And then we forget the simple things like keeping your schedule, for example. But I mean, in wearables in general, I think that closing the loop gap, some of the stuff that you're doing, where you're looking at your data and understanding it, I think you're uniquely positioned to be able to do something like that. Whereas a lot of people aren't. Either they don't understand the space well enough to interpret the data, or they don't know how to read the data, or they don't know what to do with it. Yeah. Right. So like in wearables, I think that's something that we can talk about, is like where that space is headed, but like closing the loop, so to speak, is once you capture the data, making it action.
Yeah, everyone always tells me, like I started out with the Oura Ring. I started noticing patterns. I was like, cool. And then I got the Apple Watch because I find that if I am more active throughout the day, I sleep better typically. Sometimes I sleep worse if I'm too active. The other thing I've found, especially with the Apple Watch, is that the stand reminders are good because it's on my wrist and it's bugging me. But by getting up and moving around, and this is, again, common knowledge that if you are especially a knowledge person or working with a computer, getting up every 30 minutes to an hour is it. And that was for me when at the time I was working remote on a computer and I was just tired all the time after work. And I'm like, I didn't do anything, right? I sat here and I did knowledge work and stuff. But but it was, I mean, I was physiologically just exhausted. Right. And I'm like, what the fuck? And so then I got the Apple Watch, the stand reminders. I started getting up, moving around. And then I noticed, over a few days, I was like, I feel so much better. I'm like, what the hell changed? And I was like, oh, I'm getting up and moving more. Right. And it sounds absurd, right? But you don't need an Apple Watch to do that. But for me, it's very helpful. But, and people are like, what do you do with it? Well, I have it on my wrist and it tells me that I didn't get up.
Yeah.
And I have the I don't know, I think they call it a complication on the screen or whatever. So it tells me my stand count and I've increased that. And then the new version, you can set your goals a little bit better. And so I push it to have me stand, I think it's 15 hours a day or something like that. Because I did the math of however long I'm awake typically, and I want it every hour. And it's been a huge game changer for me. But yeah, I know you're into wearables and you've made some wearables even.
Yeah. I mean, I've tinkered around. I don't know that they've been anything interesting. And that's kind of what got me to explore the whole wearable space in the first place and thinking a lot about it. And you do see the initial phases, like the data collection. That's kind of where a lot of wearables started off. Aura was a little interesting because they actually came out with something that people would wear. And I think that's, now you see a lot of smart rings out there because they sort of figured out that people will actually wear this kind of stuff.
Gen 1 looked like costume jewelry. Sorry, not so.
It's still kind of clunky, but it's gotten much better compared to the first gen.
Super ugly.
But I mean, that's kind of the interesting thing is talking about sleep. In my initial foray was building stuff to monitor my own sleep. I mean, this is a whole nother space, but the initial impetus was learning about lucid dreaming and how to induce lucid dreaming using wearables, which is a totally fringe area.
Oh, that's right.
That was the initial.
I forgot it was. So I guess maybe for folks who don't know what any of this means. Let me try to do the product thing where I say that lucid dreaming is the idea that you can consciously be in your dream and control it somehow.
Absolutely.
Where you're not awake, but you're not asleep. You're kind of somewhere in between. And that, I mean, all books have been written about this. And
Inception's a very good common popular culture film.
And I think there's not a lot of research on the topic. I think the last stuff I've kind of read concluded that you're typically in kind of an in-between phase, like delta REM or something.
And so your mind's going crazy, but you're physically stuck in sleep mode.
The parts of your brain that typically shut off when you're sleeping aren't necessarily off. And the part that is engaged with sleep is engaged. And so you are consciously unconscious in some way.
Exactly.
And there may or may not be ways to do this yourself or learn. But you were trying to figure that out, right?
There are modalities to go out there and you can learn how to do it if you train yourself. And there are tons of crazy ideas on how to do this. Going from very simple to, remembering your dreams, right? Because a lot of people will be dreaming and they don't remember, but if you put the effort into remembering your dreams, you're more likely to be quote unquote tapped in when you're in that state. So you kind of have a better sense of whether you're dreaming or not. And there's some interesting ideas that you sort of train yourself to do these really obsessive gestures such that in your dream, because they become part of who you are, you'll do them and you all of a sudden realize it doesn't have the same effect, right? So counting your fingers is one example where
I tried that
in real life. Okay.
I got a lucid dreaming book and you're supposed to tap your head or something.
You do some weird stuff.
I tried it for a few nights and I was like, this is so dumb.
yeah. But I mean, in Inception, they used the idea of the totem, right? The totem was basically the same concept. So it's rooted in some scientific ideas.
I think I stopped though when I was like, you're doing that. You're supposed to do the hand thing. I think you're supposed to like bring it in close. And I woke up one morning and my hand was on my head and my arm was like numb, and I was just like, okay, I'm gonna stop.
Yeah, I mean, beside the whole idea of it being interesting to me, it's like there's a lot of stuff we haven't explored, and dream space is one way to explore that internally, right? But it was also a practical way for me to sort of figure out the whole loop, as we're talking about with wearables and closing the loop, right? Yeah. Because there is this sort of tactic in lucid dreaming where you can try and induce lucid dreaming by flashing a low intensity light into your eyes when you're sleeping, or particularly during REM phase, which is when you would most likely be dreaming.
I just imagine the Clockwork Orange helmet with your eyeballs.
No, that's basically exactly it. Yeah, almost kind of like that. I mean, you can use a light that shines through your eyelids.
Yeah.
But the idea is that in your dream, you would sort of see these flashing lights at a consistent rate, which you have set in the real world. So that's your trigger in your dream to sort of get the idea that you are dreaming. Okay. And that kind of pushes you into recognizing that you're lucid, and then you start controlling it. Well, that was the idea. That was a principle, right? But like building the wearable was the idea of putting a sleep mask on you where you can measure the way your eyes are moving during your sleep. And when you're doing that, you can recognize REM, because one of the key characteristics of REM sleep is your eyes are moving like crazy. Mm-hmm. So you have these infrared lights that's sort of flashing infrared light onto your eyeball. And as it's moving left and right, your pupils and the whites of your eyes have a different, they absorb light differently, infrared light. So you're measuring reflections. And if you can tell that your reflections are kind of going around like crazy, you can detect, or you can estimate that someone's in REM sleep.
Yeah.
So that's your trigger into flashing the lights,
Got it.
The visible light into your eye. And then from that, that's kind of the whole loop, I think, is the measurement piece of it, which is like, are your eyes moving? And then the actionable is flashing the light into your eye to induce the dreaming. So that was a project that I actually built out, just never got it to work because you have to wear this clunky mask.
Yeah.
And every time I would wear it, I would wake up and I would no longer have the mask on my face and be in another room somehow.
I think when you first told me about that, I think that was my feedback, right? I was like, as a product person, I don't see anybody wearing a mask to bed, let alone like it's just one of those things where I don't think people realize this either. You move a lot when you sleep. Like, it's incredible,
right.
But
it's crazy. You're not even aware of it sometimes, a lot of times.
Yeah, but it's also such a great, like, I love this story too, because it's like you learned a ton of stuff, right? And you learned it was like really hard to do. And like, maybe it's an application, maybe it's just like something that doesn't make sense, but like, how did that then evolve into what was your next iteration kind of taking that?
Yeah.
Because I know you're still like in that kind of frame,
I'm still in the space. Yeah. I mean, I'll go back and either highlight my stupidity here or just kind of go into a little bit more.
Fail in public.
I did one iteration of that mask, and I actually went back and did another iteration where I tried to make it a little bit easier. So the first time was basically something I whipped together, right? And it was very uncomfortable, but the second time around, I was quote unquote smarter, and it was like, okay, well, it's got to be a little more comfortable, and maybe I need something that's a little more accurate because I didn't know if it was working. Either.
Less exposed wires too, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. So I ended up putting a device on the mask itself, and then using electrodes to measure ocular activity. So in REM sleep, since your eyes are moving, the muscles around the eyes are doing something, and you could put electrodes on different parts of your around your eyes, the canthus, so to speak, and you'll get to sort of see the activity there, engage when someone's in REM sleep. So I did that piece as well, and I, again, also failed, or maybe didn't dedicate enough time to actually try and make it work.
As a product manager, I have to point out that your evolution of this was something on your head and now something stuck to your face.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I think it's worth highlighting here. I think doing something like this was all driven by curiosity.
Yeah.
Like I wanted to really understand what lucid dreaming was.
Yep.
I kind of wanted to know what it was like to go through lucid dreaming or the experience of a lucid dream. And the training that diligence or tenacity to have failed and not have just said, "Oh, it doesn't work." It was, let's try something else and see if that works. Now the limiting factor is time.
Yeah, well, right. But not only did you try something else, you tried a different modality, right?
Yeah,
so you were trying light pulses to measure eye movement, and you're like, wow, maybe it's better to measure the muscle electrical signals to measure movement. And I remember we were chatting about it when you were kind of doing it, and I think we had a pretty good conversation about that. I think that is the better way to do it personally. And I think we've seen some really interesting kind of innovations in the whole brain space too, where it used to be you'd literally cut someone's skull off and poke it with needles or electrodes, right?
See what happens.
The hand moves. I'm kind of joking, but it's also very serious. That is what they would do. They would literally stick something in your brain. And then they were like, okay, well, we've developed technology now where we can kind of zap your skull and we can kind of trigger it and we don't have to operate, but we still prefer to cut you open. But now we've, and then, MRI machines, have kind of developed, and now we can literally see the functions of your brain without actually going in. It's still kind of a shitty process, but way better than, cranial surgery. But I think that evolution, kind of going electrical was really interesting for a lot of different reasons. And I know it's developed even more.
Yeah, exactly.
So how did you iterate or pivot, kind of to the next thing?
The reason I mentioned that second failure story was because I was using electrodes. I started to learn more about what electrodes could do and what they can measure. And there's a modality called EEG, electroencephalography, where people put electrodes on their head and you can measure brain activity.
Yep.
So again, riding that curiosity train about the brain, I wanted to see what we could learn by measuring activity in the brain. And there's tons of studies about this. It's not a new concept, right?
Yep.
But I think taking the DIY approach was the thing for me, was to really try and explore that from what can I kind of do, and can you, this technology where you might imagine is only doable with equipment from a highly funded medical lab.
Yeah, exactly.
You could do it very cheaply nowadays. And that's kind of the interesting for me is what the capabilities are, or what the possibilities are with something like this.
Yeah.
So kind of learning more about how you can read brain activity, you learn that you can actually stimulate or inhibit brain activity, particularly using electricity and electrodes. So one of the projects that I'm kind of looking at next is what they call a transcranial direct current stimulation device. And
this is for the record. I said, don't do it.
Yeah, you did mention, but I will say that there is a difference, because I know you have experience with this too, Andrew. Yeah. So this is something that we could talk about in another podcast possibly. But
that's how I stay creative. I just zap myself a little bit every day.
Honestly, joke. That is one of that. No, it's a half joke, because some people will do this. Some people will sort of inject electricity into the brain to sort of think better or focus. But transcranial direct current stimulation, or tDCS, is a modality that's been around for a while, but has a ton of different applications. There are a lot of studies that have researched it for different things, particularly around treatment of neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, or as we were joking about, people do use this as a way to focus or improve focus by stimulating certain parts of the brain while they're studying, for instance. So there's a lot of interesting applications, but it's a cheap modality that potentially has good effects based off of the scientific research. In particular, for things like depression, it has been shown that it has been fairly useful for some types of people. Yep. And with something like depression, you kind of want to, going back to some of the things we were talking about before, you want to take a shotgun approach, kind of throw whatever you can at it, right?
Exactly.
Because it's such a debilitating disease. And for people who say don't respond to drugs or have some sort of side effects that they just can't manage, who have depression, this could be a alternative modality for treatment. That's kind of what I'm trying to do is, as I mentioned, the technology is not difficult as long as you make it safe.
Which just zapping yourself with electricity. It's totally fine.
It's very, I'll reiterate, it's very, very small amounts of current. But it sort of takes that fearlessness, that insanity to kind of try and do something like this. But that is what I'm exploring is really trying to build this device and make it a cheap, low-cost device that people can use to ideally treat depression. But there are other approaches in case
that's a pretty good song.
In case it doesn't work out. Yeah.
But
a bunch of beats.
I hope the audience can hear that, because that was actually a really good song. No, I love that too. And I remember we were talking about this a little bit, and like, you know, the whole home medical device thing, like we've talked a lot about it. And I think I'll just mention, I think most of it's bullshit. Like we're getting into like snake oil salesmen again, where it's like people are selling magical elixirs, or like homeopathic medicine is something I love, because like someone joked with me once upon a time that if you have to put science in the title of the field of study, it's not actually science. You know, so it's like biology is biology, and then you get into like social science. And for everybody who's mad, I have a degree in liberal arts, and I've done a lot of social science, and it's fine. But
going back to the context,
the joke is, out of context. The joke is like, if you have to label it as science, it's kind of not maybe, but but kind of going back to the medical device thing, it's like there's this weird, so in the States at least, there's the Food and Drug Administration, which regulates all this stuff, but there's all of these weird carve-outs in the FDA regulations for things that a lot of people would look at as probably a medical device, but aren't legally classified as such. And so there's this whole market of stuff. And like Oura Ring is a great example of this, where it's not a medical device. It's not certified by the FDA. But it measures my blood pressure, I think, definitely heart rate, skin temperature, like all this stuff. And so quantifying that data and qualifying that data with like, this is a measurement of known limitations, and I'm not going to go like take drugs because my Oura Ring says something. I would go to a doctor and have their medical opinion. But I don't think people are really understanding, and this industry scares me a lot, because it's like, people don't understand that very minute difference, and to get something qualified through the FDA is like almost impossible. Like it's not, but it's incredibly difficult. It takes a very long time. You have to have a lot of evidence. And I know people have opinions on this after, especially COVID, but the reality is the system works really well. It could probably be better, but it's there to protect people, because it used to be anybody with a wagon could go town to town and sell some magical elixir, and it hurt people. And we don't want to live in a world where we hurt people. So I just want to like make that disclaimer. I know you're not trying to do any of that, but like, I think like there's a fine line between, again, like homeopathic medicine of like acupuncture, which has some evidence behind it. It's not super clear, but it seems like it works pretty well. This is kind of another one of those things where it's kind of a new like frontier, or a new pioneering space of, it doesn't seem like it's it, but we also don't quite understand why it works the way it does. And we don't quite understand how to use it. And that's a very different space than just inventing some crazy thing and saying that it's magic, right? And I want to be really clear on that with folks.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect introduction, so to speak, into my approach on this. Is you look at all the research that's out there, and you see mixed results, but a lot of it is promising. You'll find people who are, whether it's placebo or the actual technology doing something for them, it's helping them. And the question for me is, the FDA has not approved this modality or any device that I know of for this type of reasoning. So then the question is why, right? Yep. And in my exploration here, my intention is to build this device with the ultimate goal of being able to facilitate some of that academic research. And these are hypotheses, right? Going back to some of the stuff we were talking about earlier before, is I have no idea what I'm doing, but it sounds like we need more data. Well, and if the data proves that this doesn't work, then okay.
I wouldn't say you don't know what you're doing. I think you're in like the true research and development space where everything you're doing is kind of uncharted or not understood, or highly theoretical, in that people understand the principles at play, but they don't understand how to apply them, or they're not sure that they're what the conditions are to make that. And I think like when it comes to science, it's really easy for people, well, science changes all the time. Well, that's iteration, that's learning, right? And when you're on the edge of science, especially anybody who's ever done a PhD or worked with PhDs knows this, that you're literally inventing something that no one, you might know a little bit about the space. Like you said, like there's evidence, there's people kind of trying this. Most of that space is expensive. And I remember that was one of the things we were talking, because I asked you, I was like, why the hell are you doing this?
Yeah.
And, I think you made a really good point, whereas if you can make this cheaper, research laboratories can use it, and more research can be done instead of paying, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars for machines. Yeah. And I think that's really cool.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, but also just generally, like, not everything has to be a consumer product.
Mm-hmm.
And,
right.
And the idea that, you basically making a cheaper tool for somebody to use to learn from is an awesome area of our society that I don't think a lot of people think about a lot.
Yeah. I mean, this kind of ties in. I'm going to go a little bit personal here, but it does tie into my experiences in exploring an energy space, right? Going to Indonesia, Puerto Rico, there's a large disparity in wealth, and unfortunately, that's I think an inherent nature of the world. Yeah. But that's going to be a key lens you can always use to look through, where it's like if you can make something cheaper or cheap enough that delivers these basic, quote unquote, basic services, you can do a lot of good stuff, I think.
And that's like, I think too, like, I've worked in the space a little bit in psychiatric medicine. There's something called transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS.
Right.
Very different for folks at home. Up until recently, that was kind of like foo-foo, weird, not probably works. Some folks did some study on it in an academic setting and found that with people with depression, there's some, untreatable depressions or people who don't respond to medications or whatever. Mm-hmm. This thing is magical. And like, we kind of understand why. I'm not qualified to talk about it. Yeah. But, and then there's other, instances of ailments that people have that it's not some universal magic thing, but when it does work, people basically like snap out of it, right? It is basically magic for them. And they're still trying to figure out how to use it, how to learn it. And I think I want to distinguish between like that and what you're talking about is you're talking more about direct current. So you're applying very, 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 very low voltage,
very low
effectively
currents,
to the cranium,
voltage.
Right? To your skull.
Yeah.
And that's a lot cheaper because there's not magnets involved. And theoretically, if this does work and the evidence supports it, it's a lot easier and more accessible to people at home. So like, I think of blue light therapy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
10, 15 years ago, super expensive. You had to have these specialty lamps. So for people who have like seasonal depression or don't get enough vitamin D, you can get a lamp and you can supplement it. So anybody like in the Northern hemispheres, probably benefit from this. This stuff used to be super expensive. The science didn't really support it. Science started to support it. And then, people figured out ways to do it cheaper. You don't have to wear goggles now. You don't fry your retinas and stuff. Like the technology is pretty cool. And that was when we were talking about this, I was really starting to think, again, product mind, but I'm like, this is such a cool thing because if the evidence continues and you're able to get, the tool side of it, that's awesome. But then you also, if you can make this accessible to people in a cheap way, that's great.
Exactly.
Like so much of our medicine, at least in the States, is so inflated because of all the bureaucracy and everybody wants to make money on it. Things that cost dollars to make ends up costing people thousands of dollars. And I don't know if I have time for it today, but I'd love to talk about like open sourcing stuff and like patent trolling and like once the knowledge is out there in a free way, like you can't kind of take it back sort of thing. And sometimes that's really good.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's so much to talk about there. I think at least one of the things I think a lot about when it comes to this project specifically is sort of like the no loss sort of mentality. It's like, what have you got to lose kind of thing? Yep. And it's really about the learning. And I think open source is a good channel to sort of distribute that learning, right? So this is a personal venture for me. I don't have any, ultimate financial gains from this or financial desire to gain from this. But at the end of the day, if everything doesn't work, you learn something, and then you can share that through something like open source.
Well, and to your point,
open sourcing the circuit.
I just could clarify for folks who have no idea what we're talking about. Open source is the idea in software that the source code, so all the code you write, is publicly accessible along with the application. So the web browser or the podcasting app you're listening to is a bunch of code. You don't interact with the app. You interact with a compiled state. So that code is like a blueprint to a house. And so like your house, you live in your house that's constructed. You probably don't look at the blueprint ever, but that blueprint can be very helpful for an electrician who's trying to run a new electrical wire, or if you want to do an addition or something like that. And so the idea
of hardware exists too.
Yeah, exactly. And the idea of open source is, I think, totally in line with the whole point of this podcast, is sharing ideas and sharing approaches is the same thing as open source. So you didn't just come out and say, I created this really cool, device and here it is. You're talking about the iteration even. And so why this is important, because even if this fails and you are open source it, someone can come along and take a look at it and say, hey, I'm trying to do this thing, or what if it did this? And then they don't have to learn all the stuff you learned. They can just kind of pick up where you left off and go with it. And you've already demonstrated this concept in the story you told, kind of going from light to electro pulses and measuring, muscle movement of the eyes, to saying, what if I did the reverse of that? So instead of looking at what are the muscle signals doing, can I induce current to make the muscles do something in a different way, or the brain to do something in a different way to potentially treat depression or all these other things. And it's such a cool, it's just cool in general, I think. But secondly, I think it's just such a cool, like, full circle, soup to nuts, however you want to describe it, of like why this stuff works this way. And I'm sure like you didn't just like, sit under an apple tree one day and be like, gee, I'm going to build a light sensing eye movement monitor. I'm sure you worked with a whole bunch of other people's ideas and
absolutely right.
I think if there's anything folks can leave on this, is that you don't have to do anything crazy. A lot of it's just talking through what your process is, what you've learned, the context around that, I think, is even more important. And our society has gone really towards the opposite of like, just give me the answer or give me that polished story. And yes, those polished stories are important. But if you actually want to do stuff, you have to understand the context, and you have to be open about failure, and you have to work through that failure, and you have to persevere. And a lot of perseverance, I think, really comes down to understanding that it's not you and you're not alone, and there's other people failing all the time. That's the only way to kind of move forward. So we've been talking for almost a little over 2 hours now, which doesn't feel like
and honestly, we could probably talk for a lot longer, Andrew.
We'll do this again. I love this kind of free form. We covered pretty much everything in the world, I think. We even got space in there. I think for folks listening, if you've made it this far, this will be kind of, I think, indicative to future conversations. They'll be a little bit more compressed, but I'd love to have Nathan back on and talk about all the crazy shit that we're doing. Any parting advice or parting wisdom or final thoughts you want to share before we wrap?
I guess you could summarize everything as in keep curious, right?
Yeah, I love it. Cool.
Keep curious.
Well, again, I appreciate you coming on, and I think this is magical that I can be recording a podcast live. You're in Puerto Rico. I'm on the other side of the continent. We're talking in real time. For folks at home, we have video going. And the fact that we can do this in 2024 to me is just unbelievable. And then I can share this to theoretically anyone in the world. I want folks to just realize how incredible that is, and incredible the world we live in. Yeah.
Yeah. People did that.
And it took a long time, and it took a lot of technological innovation to make it happen. And it's just incredible. And I want, especially with the way the world is and everybody seems to think the world's so negative. I'd like to challenge folks, and like, we, don't have mass starvation. Like, yes, there are still hunger and starvation, but you look at, the conquests of Rome or Napoleon's marches or the Mongol invasions or the Persian. I mean, like, the world has been so much worse. I think kind of to your point with like income and disparity, like that gap is getting wider and wider, and we really need to stop that, and we need to fix that. That's probably another podcast. But I think the way that we solve all of these problems is by keeping people curious and getting curious people to try shit. Because that's the only way we're going to solve climate change, hunger, food, you know, like, and that's how we've gotten to where we are today, right?
Right.
That solution as evidenced by all of human history.
Exactly.
Awesome. All right. Well,
hey, it was a blast. Thank you for having me on, man.
Yeah, thanks so much.
All right, take care.
You can find us at 38.com. It's like the word create, but with a 3 instead of the C. As always, we encourage you to listen, watch, do. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.